On this edition of Independent Sources, an historic election in Brazil. A woman could take over the reins of the country.
Why is Latin America's economy growing while others around the world are floundering?
And a journalist who is reinventing himself online. Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre.
And I'm Vianora Vinca. Dilma Rousseff may very well become the most powerful woman in Latin America if, as expected, she wins Brazil's presidential election runoff at the end of this month.
According to The Independent, the former guerrilla could outrank both German Chancellor Angela Merkel and U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton as the most powerful woman in the world.
Handpicked by the popular outgoing president Lula da Silva, Rousseff has faced sharp criticism from some who say she's inexperienced and cagey about her past.
I spoke with Osmar Freitas Jr. of the Brazilian network TV Record and Roberto Lima of the Brazilian Voice about Rousseff. Dilma Rousseff was all but proclaimed president of Brazil. What happened?
Well, first of all, we saw in the past 10 days a dip in the polls. Mrs. Marina Silva was growing more than anyone previewed. And this played a big role into the runoff. I believe that Ms. Rousseff knew beforehand that there would be a runoff because President Lula said 2 days ago that, hey, a runoff is not so bad because I never won in the first run. So they practically knew that. It doesn't mean that they like it, but.
So under Brazil's electoral laws, a candidate has to have 50% of the vote plus one to avoid a runoff, right? So essentially, Rousseff won last Sunday's election, but not by enough votes to outright win the election, so we have a runoff on October 31st. Tell us a little bit more about Rousseff. Who is she?
Oh, she was she's been a long time, member of the Workers' Party in Brazil. She's somebody that the president liked very much, and he chose her name to continue what he's doing. And she had a very, she has a very important track in the history of the modern Brazil. She fought the military. She was involved in guerrillas and stuff, and she's a very strong woman, And I think it's about time for Brazil to have a Brazilian a woman as a president. It's we're making strides here, I guess.
A lot has been said about her being Lula's protege. How much of that is true?
Well, excuse me the joke, but I would say that she's her own man. Obviously, Lula will put his 2 cents, but he will put 2 cents in the government of anyone.
Is he that popular?
He is popular, and he cannot contain himself. He will have to talk about the way the country is run. Mm-hmm. But also, we have to remember there's a party, a strong party, behind Ms. Rousseff. Mm-hmm. And these people fight among themselves in terms of policies, and the strongest sector of the party will implement whatever they decide. And what they decide before was in the policy that you saw during the President Lula's administration, and you will see a continuation of the same because it's doing good to the country.
No matter who wins the election, either Sher or Dilma, I think it's going to be, they're going to be keeping on the same track that Lula has been walking on.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I agree, and there are very little difference between one and another. First of all, the Workers' Party will try to give some help, more help, to the C class, which used to be the Z class.
Now, you're talking about under Lula, Brazil is now the biggest economy in Latin America. It has been for a while, but now it is playing outside of this region into the world stage economically. Now, how has Lula been able to accomplish that? I believe that 34 million people went from the Z class to the C class that you were talking about, Oscar.
Well, first of all, there's a group of facts that helped. One of the policies of the Workers' Party is to have some state interference on the economy, meaning they will interfere in the social economic dynamic of the country, helping the poor, giving some sort of food stamp that we never had, which is named Bolsa Familia, which liberates some of the money that these poor people would have to spend in food towards spending in other things. So they start to be consumers. They were not. They were survivors. And also, to be able to get a Bolsa Familia, this food stamps, you will have to prove that your kids, your son, your daughter, your children, are going to school. Does it happen all the time? No. Some people, you know,
Sure.
you cannot control all this. But this gave an immense push into the C class, now knowing C class. But also, we have to see that Brazil is doing very good in terms of commodities and in terms of industrial products.
Sure. Speaking of that, Roberto, what are some of these commodities and industrial products? What makes Brazil such a industrial power?
Brazil is well known by having natural resources and
Such as?
oil.
We
Right.
don't often think of Brazil as an oil producer.
Oh yes, it's offshore, but we're becoming a power in that area too, which is a great thing. And the last 12 years, Brazil has growing a lot. And what I see when I go to Brazil, I didn't have that feeling before. The distance between Brazil and bigger countries like the U.S. or countries in Europe, you know, shrank a little bit. You know, like 15, 20 years ago, you went to Brazil and, you know, all you could see is poverty and stuff like that. Not today. Mm-hmm. Not today. And I think that part of that is the change, you know, the government implemented in the country.
So this is a case where a mixture of government policy and private sector investment has been able to move the society along.
That's the right recipe, I think.
I think it is, and also it's very important to see that the private sector wasn't bothered by the state. In the beginning of the Lula administration, a decision was made to let the state take care of social needs, economic social needs of the poor people, but leave alone the private sector. Help them bring investments. Well, Brazil got the foreign debt paid because of investments that were made in the country. Brazil has a huge reserve now because of the private sector. And the private sector will furnish the country with jobs. Okay. So this is the recipe for the success, plus all the need of China, of the material, that raw material that Brazil has.
So Roberto, tell me a little bit about the diaspora participation in the political process in Brazil. Can they vote, and was there a large turnout?
It's mandatory. You have to vote. You know, by Brazilian law, you're obligated to go to, you know, to a place where you can vote, and you gotta vote, even if you don't vote when you get there, but you gotta show up.
Okay, why? I mean, why did they come up with such a law?
I think this. I have no idea why that happened.
Well, one of the reasons is because they saw the American model, that the pools will go down, the vote will go down. People that vote are very little a month of the population in general. So they decide to obligate everybody to vote, so everybody has to have this.
Unfortunately, we had to leave it at that. Roberto Lima, thanks for being with us. And Osmar Freitas Jr., thanks for being with us.
It was my pleasure.
Still ahead, Latin America makes a case for no longer being the Yankees' backyard. But before that, Abi Ishola has some other news.
Thanks, Vianora. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. From El Diario La Prensa, Senators Robert Menendez and Patrick Leahy have introduced a new bill for immigration reform. The proposal makes several recommendations, including a boost in border security, inclusion of the DREAM Act, and the Uniting Families Act that would provide legal immigration to same-sex couples. Dan Stein of the Federation for American Immigration Reform opposes the bill, calling it last-minute political theater designed to impress special interest voters. From the Amsterdam News, America's poverty rate is the highest it's been since 1959. A recent report from the U.S. Census Bureau finds that in 2009, 1 in 7 Americans lived in poverty, which adds up to over 40 million people. The United States government considers a family of 4 with an annual income of up to $21,000 impoverished. Black America Web reports that increased unemployment rates may hurt President Obama's chances of being reelected in 2012. A new survey conducted by Politico and George Washington University shows that only 38% of voters feel Obama deserves to be reelected. The study also found that a growing number of people trust Republicans rather than President Obama to create jobs. Some Jews are on edge about the recent success of Tea Party candidates in the Republican primary races. The Forward reports that Jewish voters are skeptical about Tea Party ideas, ranging from social conservatism to the suggestion that the U.S. cut foreign aid, which could include the $3 billion Israel receives from the U.S. yearly. And finally, from Caribbean Life, Kraft Foods is teaming up with a nonprofit organization, Kaboom, to create a brand new playground in Harlem. The new play area will be constructed at Odyssey House Family Center, a facility for individuals and families dealing with substance abuse and homelessness. Those are just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Back to Garry and Vianora in the studio.
A recent report from The Economist notes that while economies around the world are suffering, Latin America's has grown by over 5% every year between 2003 and 2008.
That number may not seem like a lot, but it's significant to a region long associated with economic instability.
I sat down with author and activist Mario Nuñez Mariel and Mark Weisbrot of the Center for Economic and Policy Research to get an idea of what's fueling this growth and the possible consequences for the region's relationship with the United States. Mark, what are some of the major causes driving the Latin American economies upward at a time when most of the world is concerned with widespread economic crisis?
Well, you have a lot of, it varies by country. You have a lot of commodity exporters, including, Venezuela and Ecuador export oil. Bolivia, it's hydrocarbons, mostly natural gas. Brazil, obviously a whole range of agricultural commodity exports. So that's part of it, but I think also, it depends what you look at and what moment you're looking at. But in 2009, for example, a majority of the countries in Latin America did succeed in staying out of recession. And a lot of that was due to their macroeconomic policies. That is, they pursued counter-cyclical policies. The governments spent more. Some of them loosened their monetary policy. And so that was a result of the fact that they weren't so tied to the international financial markets, so you didn't get as much contagion that way. Now, the countries that were tied to the United States, for example, like Mexico, suffered the steepest loss in output, almost 8% of GDP in 2009, because, 3/4 of its trade is with the United States. And that was true for other countries with, the CAFTA, Central America Free Trade Agreements, Dominican Republic. They got hit harder, and some of them are still not doing that well.
But according to The Economist, Mexico is also forging ahead despite its ties to the sickly U.S. economy.
Well, Mexico is recovering now, but again, they took a very hard hit in 2009, so they're coming from a very low base too.
Mario, let's talk a little more about Mexico, since you've been writing extensively about it. The news lately has been pretty grim, putting forward mostly the heightened violence, a case of violence that the country hasn't seen in many decades. How's the economy doing from your perspective in this context?
You know, as Mark says, now we are growing very little, 2-3%, but we are growing. What is amazing is that we are growing in the middle of a certain kind of a civil war. The violence goes much more than a simple fact of violence. It's really a deep structural crisis of the country. And it's not only on the level of the economy, it's in all levels. It's really an extreme crisis because the violence of the cartels is related to the economy also. The cartels are handling almost $40 billion a year. And the informal economy is a huge part of the economy in the country. Then we are living in a dysfunctional life in Mexico. It's a dysfunctional way of living. And I don't know what's going to happen, nobody knows. It's very difficult to predict in a magical way what's going to happen with this level of violence. But I can assure you that we need a very deep reform after the violence is going to be stabilized, or after we handle the situation with the narco war in a better way.
Mark, I'd like to talk about the poor, given these promising economic figures. According to an article in The Economist, again, it is reported that tens of millions of people are climbing out of poverty and joining the middle class. Is that your assessment as well?
Well, there was definitely some poverty reduction before the recession, but the biggest drops were, and The Economist won't mention that, of course, but their reporting on Venezuela is very hostile. But in fact, Venezuela, in that period, from 2003 to 2008, cut poverty by half and extreme poverty by 70%. And according to the UN Economic Commission on Latin America, just released a report this year, they also reduced inequality more than any other country, ending up with the most equal distribution of income in the region. Other countries had smaller gains, but still significant.
Let's talk about Venezuela, if you'd like, Mario, since Mark brought that point up. And is there a sense, let's broaden it up within Latin America, that the region is no longer U.S.'s backyard?
Well, that's a matter of ideological perception. I never thought in Mexico or Latin America as a backyard of the United States. I think that was a kind of reduction of what really means Latin America, almost for the United States. It's not the backyard of anybody. What it really happens is that our relationship with the United States is really mixed up. It's a very complex, very difficult relationship. And I believe that the United States doesn't understand that a better relationship with Latin America will be the best, not only in economical terms, in human terms. I believe that we are working out from a very backward structural position where we have enormous tragedies in our countries that are there and that is still being significant in terms of everyday life. That's a really important thing, that when you have 50 million persons in extreme poverty, it's an enormous quantity of people. Okay. Then, in qualitative terms, well, obviously, if we grow, it's much better than if we don't. If poverty is reduced, it's much better than if it's not. But I believe that we should make something else. It has to be a more structural, more deep reform, not only economical, but also about the institutional way of life. that has to be done for really taking care of the poor people in our countries.
Mark, you've mentioned some of the causes for the growing economies in Latin America, and one cause that I'd like us to talk about is the increased interest from China and India in the continent. How does that change the relationships that Latin America has economically with the world, including the United States?
You see, so as a source of foreign exchange, I think it's the most important source of demand as well, and a source of direct investment. I agree with Mariel that Latin America was never just the backyard as many people here in Washington imagined it. On the other hand, South America in particular, I would say, is more independent of the United States than Europe is now, and that certainly was never true in the past 150 years. So I would consider this a huge epic-making change that we've seen over the last decade to decade and a half, where you've had these elections in Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, and now you see that the left governments have been elected, and they're pursuing their own policies economically, very, in some cases quite different from what Washington had kind of coerced the region to adopt since the early 1980s. And that, in fact, was, I think, the major cause of this big shift at the ballot box, is that you had a long-term economic failure from 1980 to 2000, for example. The income per person in Latin America, which is the most basic measure that economists have of economic progress, it only grew by 9% as compared to 82% in the prior 20 years. So this was a failure of epic proportions, and this is why I think you see this change. So I don't think a lot of the changes you're seeing now, the positive changes, would not have been possible if the United States had maintained the kind of control it had over the region in the prior 25 years.
We only have about 30 seconds left. I'd like to give Mario the last word, a final thought.
Well, I agree with Mark. If the neoliberal policies were not taken on, I think we will have a better situation now. But the fact is that we live the neoliberal policies as a pattern of dogmatism. It was the Washington consensus. It was so strong, the imposition of that way of behaving in economical terms, that it took us to a deep crisis, the deepest in our history. But at the same time, I want to mark that the position of Washington and the United States were extremely wrong from Latin America practically always. But also the leftist position from the United States was really wrong. They were trying to win this possibility of development through the armed movement. And then I think now we are for the first time in a position, Latin America and the United States, to get to an hemispheric understanding, a better understanding, for really start to work together. I think that will be the real consequence of these last 40, 50 years of nastiness.
And it's always great to read titles like Economic Renaissance, so we'll be glad to follow on the developments on the Latin American economies. And thank you very much for joining us in studio today, Mario Nuñez Mariel and Mark Weisbrot. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was very glad to be here.
When we come back on Independent Sources, Journalism 2.0.
And finally from us tonight, the speculation that newspapers are dying started even before the economic collapse. Then the layoffs followed. Now many journalists have had to reinvent themselves using the World Wide Web. Marlene Peralta found one such journalist turned web entrepreneur in Queens.
Él te recibe sin problema. Y tú ya como conoces el ambiente, sabes qué esperas ahí.
Javier Castaño is one of the many journalists trying to relaunch their careers in these tough economic times.
pretty soon I'm not going to have friends who have a job, because if you see Univision and you see Telemundo and you see what happened in the print media and the magazines, everybody's just getting the layoff, and that's terrible. So I have to figure out how to do something by my own, because I don't want to be hired for a company for a few months or a few years and then start again.
To that end, the veteran journalist who worked for El Diario La Prensa in Hoy, Nueva York, launched queenslatino.com in May.
queenslatino.com is local, because the growing of the media is going to be local, and it's based on the understanding of the Latino community. I understand the Latino community. I know the smell of the project. I know how people behave in our communities, in our houses.
Independent media expert Abi Sher says that journalists in ethnic media are especially prepared to make the leap from reporter to publisher.
Especially when you work in the independent press and the ethnic press, you tend to be a generalist. You know how to do everything. So you are very well trained for setting up a new enterprise. So there's always a lot of ferment and entrepreneurship.
However, Sher warns about the challenges journalists turned business owners like Castaño may encounter.
The medium and small business owners are major advertisers in ethnic and community papers. So if they're not getting loans because of the freeze in the financial markets and banks are ignoring them, they're not able to expand, they're not able to invest, and that makes it a very difficult time to launch a new publication.
Castaño is well aware of the financial difficulties a publication like his can face.
When you go outside in the Latino community and you ask a restaurant or a boutique to advertise in a digital media, they don't even know what we are talking about. So it's tough, but it's getting there. And, but that's what my business model includes: the print edition that is monthly, and also the digital version, which I upload every single day.
The one thing Castaño says he's short of is that operating a low-budget publication doesn't mean you can't make headlines.
And I prove it. My website is only 2 weeks old, and I have the exclusive of the Spies story. So that's very important. That is strong. People are following me because of that.
Castaño says the Spy story highlights why some mainstream media's efforts to approach ethnic communities are falling short. He thinks it's because they often overlook the ethnic faces in these stories.
If you see the Anglo media, what they are following is this beautiful Russian model, Anna Chapman. They don't even care about the Latino reporter or columnist from El Diario La Prensa. They even misspell her name and the name of her husband.
His goal is to empower the community and keep Latino stories in the news. Although the print edition is monthly for now, he hopes for a weekly edition in the future.
And the goal is to serve the community better. The goal is to help those Latino out there to understand the city and the power of the city better, and even to connect to the world, because the internet can do that.
For Independent Sources, I am Marlene Peralta.
That's our show. Thanks for watching, and we hope you will join us again next week.
Till then, be independent-minded.